This time next year, who will be living in number 10? Rishi Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer? After 13 years of the Tories, is it finally time for a change? We don't have a crystal ball, of course, but we do know that there will be a general election next year. The Conservatives could have dragged it out till the end of January 2025. But last week the Prime Minister ruled that out. Rishi Sunak thought he could turn the government's fortunes around, but the Conservatives are still languishing 20 points behind Labour in the polls. Here's pollster Joe Twyman.
Rishi Sunak is behind Keir Starmer, and by some distance when it comes to the question of who is the better leader. And crucially, when it comes to the question of which party is best to deal with the economy, the most important issue going into the election next year. We see that Labour have held a lead of around about sort of 10 to 15 points now, consistently for months and months.
Sir Keir Starmer says Labour are ready.
We are ready for a general election. I've had my whole team on a general election footing for some time now. I think that given the complete state of failure now in the country, there's a real sense that everything is broken, nothing is working, that the sooner that election comes, the better.
Plenty of Conservative MPs think the next election is already lost. But former Justice Secretary Sir Robert Buckland is more hopeful.
I think that things will narrow. I think people will start increasingly to ask questions of this Labour opposition and realise that, like the Emperor, they have no clothes. They're not ready for government. They're not fit for government. If the Prime Minister and the Chancellor carry on in the right track, reducing inflation, dealing with the cost of living, helping to grow our economy, then I think the British public will say, we want more of that, please.
And despite the polls, Joe Twyman says Labour face a huge task to win.
They need to gain 124 seats, it's estimated, at the next election in order to get a majority of just 2. The only person who's ever achieved larger gains than that was Tony Blair in 1997.
So when are we likely to go to the polls? May or next autumn?
So I think that the most likely option is probably October or November time, perhaps late November, so as not to clash with the US presidential election at the start of that month. But we can't rule out May either. Ultimately, we don't know, neither does Rishi Sunak.
The USA will elect its next president on November the 5th. Whether that's Biden, Trump or someone else, we'll look sedate in comparison. But what issues will dominate the election here? Immigration, legal and illegal, the NHS, crime? Here's Twyman again.
And it's rare that simply one subject dominates the election. But if you ask people what's the most important issue facing them and their family, or indeed what's the most important issue facing the country, the cost of living comes top and by some distance.
Rishi Sunak hopes that with inflation down and tax cuts coming, people will start to feel better off next year. He hopes too for flights to Rwanda. We don't know what 2024 will bring, but we do know that on one day, we, the British public, will get to choose who runs the country. Catherine Forster, GB News.
Joining us now is the assistant editor at Conservative Home, William Atkinson. Good morning, William. In terms of the date of a potential election next year, how much prominence does the US election in November have on Sunak's decision? I mean, is it going to pose a problem if they're held at the same time? What's the mechanics of it?
Well, there's only really been sort of one recent instance, and I use recent in a very loose sense, of a UK general election and a US presidential election coinciding, and that was in 1964 when Britain had an election in October and the US had an election, obviously, in November. I imagine it's going to obviously be a factor in Rishi Sunak's thinking, because you'll have a lot of senior civil servants and diplomats whispering in his ear saying, "You sure you want to do this, Prime Minister?" Just because we may have a situation where you have a new government, or a new president, I should say, in the United States and a new government in the UK simultaneously. But ultimately, I wouldn't say it's going to be the overwhelming factor in when Rishi Sunak decides to go to the country. I think there's a far greater number of other pressures, both sort of political and indeed diplomatic, but especially economic, that will decide as to when he actually chooses to go.
How dirty, William, do you think this election campaign is going to be? Do you think it's likely to get very personal? I mean, we already know Labour and the Tories, they do have form when it comes to the sort of things they put out on social media.
Yes, I think you saw this year, for example, Labour suggesting that Rishi Sunak doesn't actually believe in locking up sort of violent criminals, and I think that sort of thing from both parties is going to increasingly appear. I think CCHQ is basically planning on having a long campaign starting in January, and it spends lots of time accumulating a lot of stuff on Keir Starmer's record, first as a human rights lawyer, and then as the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. And I think you're going to see something similar to what was done over Willie Horton with Michael Dukakis in 1988 in the US. There's going to be a consistent attack on Keir Starmer's records, on his personality, on his character, to suggest that he is fundamentally unfit to lead the country. And I imagine Labour will launch a similar attack on Rishi Sunak based on his personal wealth, but also more obviously on his record over the last 2 years.
William, what are you hearing in Conservative circles when it comes to the date of this election? Are we nailed on for spring, or will the government want to get the effects of those economic policies into the system so voters can feel a bit better off for later in the year?
Whether the election is called in spring will not necessarily be as much of Rishi Sunak's decision as you might hope. Because, quite frankly, if he's planning on sort of launching a package of tax cuts in early March, I didn't imagine him going to shift the dial very much. And I think also the prediction is that inflation will take quite a long time to come down. He's probably also going to hope that the Bank of England will start cutting interest rates in the summer, which I think makes it sort of more likely that the election will be in October, November. However, he is trying to get his Rwanda bill through Parliament, and I imagine that will likely be rejected by the House of Lords. He doesn't have time in the remaining parliamentary session to use the Parliament Act to try and get the legislation through. So I think he may be forced into a situation where we may see a sort of surprise general election early next year fought on the Rwanda policy, which isn't, I think, the issue on which Rishi Sunak would like to fight an election, but he might find himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. And also, quite frankly, if you have a sort of repeat of the scenes that we saw over the immigration bill just last month, there might be an increasing speculation of some form of leadership challenge to Rishi Sunak, which I personally think would be utterly insane, but would at least sort of prompt Number 10 to consider going to the country in order to preserve their own position.
Do you really think that is a possibility, that there could be a leadership challenge before the election, which could be in a matter of months? That sounds absolutely bonkers.
From conversations I've had with Tory MPs and others within the SW1 circle, it's a prospect that I wouldn't rule out. I think it's somewhat less likely now than it was only a few weeks ago, but I would nevertheless say that it's probably humming somewhere in the background. As I say, I think it would be utterly ludicrous, and I think it would cause a country that already wants to kick the Tories out to hate us even more and want to sort of see the back of this government even sooner. But nevertheless, Tory MPs are a very old and a very fickle bunch.
William, who would replace Sunak if and when he's challenged for the leadership and loses?
I imagine whether a leadership election is held before or after the next election, the front runners will be people like Kemi Badenoch, who has been voted the Minister of the Year in Conhome's survey out today, Penny Mordaunt, or Suella Braverman, or indeed James Cleverly. So I think there's quite a wide field of potential contenders. Conservative Home obviously is not backing a candidate and will not speculate until we have a leadership election, whenever that's be. And as I must say, don't rule out the prospect of one before the next election, but I'd say it's overwhelmingly likely that it would happen after the next election, whatever the result of that would be. Let's not rule out a Conservative victory, I would say.
You said something there, William, about Tory MPs being a very fickle bunch. Isn't that part of their problem at the moment, that they are quite divided with all these different factions, and Labour, so many, are far more united?
Yes, I think there's a natural sort of tendency towards unity when you're 20 points ahead in the polls. You've got, if Labour believe that they can sort of cling together for the next few months, that's going to get them into office, then naturally they have an incentive to be united. And remember, there's a record number of sort of ex-ministers on the Tory backbenches. There's also, we've had 5 prime ministers in 13 years. Tory MPs have got very used to kicking out a leader as soon as the sort of political situation looks rather dicey. As I say, I think this is an awful tendency, both for stability of government, but also for the sort of mental and indeed political health of the Conservative Party as a whole. I think it makes the party look rather farcical. And it's rather depressing to be on the sort of outside looking in when there is so much the country actually needs the Conservatives to be getting on with, whether that is tackling both the extensive legal and illegal immigration or cutting spending and trying to deliver tax cuts. And instead we're sort of plotting once again sort of who should be the next leader. And I think it makes the Conservative Party, with its long and storied history of governing this country through good times and bad, look, as I say, increasingly farcical. And that's a rather depressing outlook for 2024 for the party as a whole.
William, Reform UK have said they will not do what the Brexit Party did in 2019 and stand aside for the Tories to sweep to victory. They said they're going to stand in every seat bar Northern Ireland. How much of an impact is that going to have on the election? And will it, as some suggest, hand the keys to Starmer to number 10?
I don't think it will simultaneously sort of hand the keys to Keir Starmer. I think there's a significant enough number of, according to the opinion polls, voters considering switching from the Tories to Labour or directly from voting for the Tories to not voting at all. That Labour's lead is already quite substantial. And I would say also Reform UK has been something of a damp squib so far. It hasn't been very successful in either local elections or by-elections. I think all of that might change if Nigel Farage returns, as is rumoured, in the next few months to lead the party.
Well, they're polling ahead of the Lib Dems, William, in some sectors.
Of the polls, and that would look particularly dicey for the Conservative Party.
Sorry to interrupt. You said they've had not much success, but they're polling ahead of the Lib Dems, and they would argue that.
Well, I think the Lib Dems have won several by-elections during this Parliament, so I think it's the difference between short-term voter apathy being transformed into telling the pollsters that they'd actually vote for Reform UK to them actually doing so in practice, which, as I say, so far has been a rather distant prospect to the party. I think also they're not particularly well run, and I don't think their media operation has been particularly successful either. I don't think their sort of current combination of Lib Dem-style constitutional reform and harping on about lockdown is really what the sort of public are particularly aiming for. And I don't think it's actually going after the sort of voters that they should be looking for, which are those sort of red wall types who want higher government spending and sort of a more sort of socially conservative approach to everything from immigration to woke issues. As I say, I think, Reform UK remains something of an irrelevance, but that might change if Nigel Farage comes back to lead them.
I'll just briefly push back on their behalf. I mean, you say they're not particularly well run, but most of the operation is the Brexit Party, which the Tories begged to stand aside in 19. And also, UKIP got 4 million votes in 2015, which was a massive surprise, albeit they only got one seat, but they did attract the vote share.
Well, I think that's the crucial thing, though. In politics, it doesn't matter if you're racking up a large number of votes if you're not actually getting any seats. Which is why I think, UKIP, remember, in 2015 managed to rack up 4 million votes, but you still had a Tory majority. So if I remain sceptical that Reform UK, under their current leadership, and indeed perhaps under Farage's as well, has the sort of political nous to stand where they're needed to stand and actually direct their resources into the sorts of seats they might actually win. For all its sort of faults, CCHQ has been historically far better than that, which is why the Tories have been far better at winning elections and why, as I say, I think Reform UK currently remains something of a damp squib.
William Atkinson, Assistant Editor at Conservative Home. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for talking to us on Britain's Newsroom this morning.